Samantha had always been close to her older brother Mark. Growing up, they shared everything, the good and the bad. There were the childhood memories of endless summer days spent playing in the yard, sneaking candy when their parents weren't looking, and getting into trouble together. As they got older, their bond evolved into something deeper. They became each other's confidants, talking late into the night about their dreams, fears, and everything in between. But like many siblings, they had their moments of disagreement too. Their fights were loud and sometimes hurtful, but they always found a way to reconcile, to go back to being the siblings who had each other's backs no matter what. Or at least, that's what Samantha thought. When Samantha found out she was pregnant, the world as she knew it started to feel unstable. At first, there was the shock, the overwhelming realization that she was about to become a mother. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but she knew she had to be. The father wasn't in the picture. They had broken up months before, and he hadn't been a part of her life for a long time. She had always been close to her parents, and in her mind she thought they would support her through this difficult time. But when she told them, the reaction was not what she expected. They weren't angry or disappointed, but their concern was apparent. They weren't entirely sure how to handle the situation, and their advice was a mix of encouragement and caution. "It's going to be a lot to handle, Sam," her father had said, his voice filled with concern. "We're here for you, of course, but you should really think about your options." While her parents' support was there, Samantha felt the weight of their uncertainty. She wasn't looking for pity or fear, she just wanted understanding. It was a difficult time for her. She wanted to feel secure, like she had a plan. She needed someone she could rely on, someone who could offer her a sense of comfort and stability. Her mother suggested that perhaps she should move in with them, but their home was too far from where Samantha lived, and she wasn't sure about making that kind of change during such a fragile time. That's when she turned to Mark. Mark had always been the practical one. He had a steady job, his own apartment, and a seemingly perfect life. He wasn't married, didn't have children, but he had always been there for her in the past. He was protective in a way that made her feel safe, and Samantha believed that if anyone could help her through this, it would be Mark. She didn't want to burden their parents, and she figured it would be easier for her to stay close to her job and her community while leaning on Mark for support. When she asked him if she could move in with him, she expected him to say yes without hesitation. They had always helped each other, and this was no different, she thought. But the response she got from Mark was nothing like she expected. At first, he seemed reluctant. He said he wasn't sure if it was the best idea, that it might be a lot to handle. Samantha could hear the discomfort in his voice, but she tried to reassure him. She told him she would be responsible, that she wouldn't impose, and that she just needed somewhere to stay while she figured things out. After some hesitation, Mark finally agreed. "Fine," he said. "You can stay here for a while, but only until you figure things out. I'm not running a daycare." Samantha was grateful for the offer, but something in Mark's tone lingered in the back of her mind. It didn't feel like the supportive brother she had known for years, but she brushed it off. She was grateful, and she needed a place to stay. She packed up her things and moved into Mark's apartment, hoping that everything would work out. She didn't expect things to be perfect, but she thought they would find a way to make it work. In the beginning, everything seemed fine. Mark didn't make her feel unwelcome, but the tension was undeniable. It wasn't long before the little things started to bother him. Samantha was careful not to overstep her boundaries. She cleaned up after herself, kept to herself as much as possible, and tried to stay out of Mark's way. But no matter how hard she tried to be considerate, things began to unravel. At first, it was the small annoyances. Mark would get frustrated when she used the bathroom too long, or when she took longer than he thought was necessary to get ready. He would make passive-aggressive comments about how messy the place was getting, even though she was doing her best to keep everything neat. Samantha tried to laugh it off, but the tension was starting to feel suffocating. The turning point came one evening when they had a big argument. Samantha had been feeling increasingly uncomfortable in Mark's apartment. She was pregnant, emotional, and hormonal, and the last thing she needed was to feel like a burden. She had been trying to make dinner when Mark came home from work and immediately started complaining about how the apartment smelled. It was a minor thing, but it was enough to trigger a breakdown. "What's your problem?" Samantha snapped, her voice shaky with emotion. "I'm doing my best here, okay? I'm trying to make things work, and you're acting like I'm ruining your life." Mark's face tightened. "You're not ruining anything," he said, his voice cold. "But you need to understand that I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for you to come here. I didn't ask to have my life turned upside down." Samantha stared at him, stunned. She hadn't expected this. Mark had always been the one to help her, the one to protect her. But now he was looking at her like she was a nuisance. "I didn't want to be in this position either, Mark," she said quietly. "But I need help. I thought you'd understand that." Mark shook his head, visibly frustrated. "I can't keep doing this, Sam. I have my own life to live. I don't have time to babysit you." The words stung. Samantha had never heard him speak to her like this before. She had always seen him as someone who would never abandon her, someone who would always have her back. But now she felt completely alone. The argument escalated with neither of them backing down. In the end, Mark threw his hands up in frustration. "I'm sorry, Sam, but you need to leave. I can't keep doing this." Samantha was speechless. She felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her. She had nowhere else to go, and now, her brother, the one person she thought would always be there for her, was kicking her out. I don't know where to go, Mark," she said, her voice trembling. "Figure it out," he replied, his tone final. "I've done enough." She stood there for a moment, in shock, as Mark turned his back on her. She didn't know what to do. She didn't have the energy to fight him anymore. She grabbed her things, her heart heavy with the weight of what had just happened. She never imagined that things would turn out this way. Samantha left the apartment that night, her mind reeling. She didn't know where to go. Her parents lived far away, and she knew that they wouldn't be able to help her. She had always believed that family would come through in the end, but now she wasn't so sure. As she walked through the city, the cold air biting at her skin, she thought about the life she had left behind. She had always prided herself on being independent, but now she realized just how vulnerable she was. She didn't know what her next step would be, but one thing was certain. The world felt much darker now that her own brother had turned his back on her. Samantha stood outside Mark's apartment, her belongings piled in an old suitcase beside her. The cold air stung her face, but the chill in her heart was even more unbearable. Her mind was spinning. She had just been kicked out by her brother, the one person she thought would never turn his back on her. He had always been her protector, her confidant. And now, he had tossed her aside with barely a second thought. She had nowhere to go, and the weight of the situation hit her with full force. Her options were slim. Her friends were all either busy with their own lives or living too far away to help. She couldn't bear to burden them with this. As she looked at the empty street in front of her, she felt utterly alone, her mind drifting toward the one place she thought might offer some refuge, her parents' house. She had grown up in a small suburban town a few hours away. Her parents had always been there for her, providing guidance, love, and security throughout her life. Her father, James, was a steady and dependable man, the kind of person who would do anything for his family. Her mother, Evelyn, was warm and caring, always ready with a cup of tea and a listening ear. Samantha had always believed that no matter what happened, she could turn to them for support. In her mind, there was no doubt they would help her during this difficult time. They might not understand everything she was going through, but they would understand her need for love, support, and stability. They would welcome her with open arms. She convinced herself of this, even as doubt lingered at the back of her mind. Samantha called her mother the moment she stepped out of the building. Her voice was shaky as she explained the situation, recounting everything that had happened with Mark. She expected her mother to be upset, to express concern for her well-being and offer to help. After all, she was her daughter, and surely her parents would be the ones to show her love when the rest of the world seemed to be against her. But Evelyn's response was not what Samantha had hoped for. "Sam, I'm so sorry you're going through this, but you need to understand your brother. Mark has always been a very private person, and this situation is just too much for him. You have to give him space. I think it was really brave of him to let you stay there for as long as he did." Samantha felt a pang of disbelief. "Brave? Mom, he kicked me out. He said I was a burden. I don't know where else to go." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I understand this is hard for you, but maybe you should consider moving back here with us. We can help you, but we're not in a position to just drop everything. You know how busy things are here. You might need to make some hard decisions about how you handle this pregnancy, and I think it might be a good idea to really think it through before you make any more decisions." Samantha felt a wave of anger rise within her. She was in a crisis, and her mother was talking to her as if she were just another problem to be managed. "I don't need advice right now, Mom. I need help. I thought you would be there for me, but instead I'm being told I'm a burden. Mark kicked me out like I was some kind of inconvenience." "I'm sorry, Sam, I really am. But maybe you should try to talk to Mark again. He's your brother, and you need to find a way to make things work between you. You know how hard he works, and he's been under a lot of stress lately." The words stung more than Samantha could ever have imagined. It wasn't that her parents were unsympathetic. They were just distant. They weren't the support system she thought they would be. Samantha couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her mother was making excuses for Mark. It was as if her own feelings, her own needs didn't matter. She was supposed to just accept that Mark's frustration was more important than her own suffering. Her parents weren't offering comfort. They were simply reinforcing the idea that she had somehow caused this mess and needed to figure it out on her own. "I don't want to talk to Mark again, Mom. I don't even want to go back there. I need something from you right now, not a lecture. Please, just help me." Her voice broke on the last sentence. She was trying so hard to hold it together, but it felt like the ground was slipping out from beneath her. Her parents' refusal to stand up for her, to acknowledge her pain, was devastating. She felt like an orphan, even though they were still alive, breathing, and just a phone call away. She needed them to be her family, to be there when she was at her lowest, and they were giving her excuses instead? "I understand, Sam," Evelyn said after a long pause, "but we have our own lives here. Your father and I are trying to help you as best we can, but you have to understand that we can't always just drop everything and come running." Samantha's heart sank. "So that's it then? You're not going to help me?" There was a brief silence. "We'll talk more when you're ready to come home. But we can't fix everything for you. You have to take responsibility for your choices." And with that, the conversation ended. Samantha stood there, phone in hand, feeling as though the life she had known was falling apart piece by piece. Her parents weren't going to rescue her. They weren't going to save her from the mess she was in. She had expected unconditional love and support, but instead, she got more of the same. The weight of responsibility placed squarely on her shoulders. The idea that everything that had gone wrong was somehow her fault. The realization that she was truly alone hit her hard, and for the first time in her life, she felt like a stranger in her own family. For the next few days, Samantha tried to keep herself busy. She moved into a small, cheap apartment, scouring online listings for places she could afford. But the apartments were either too expensive or too run down. She didn't have the money for the rent or the security deposit, and the thought of asking for help again felt humiliating. She couldn't bear the thought of going back to her parents after everything that had happened. The idea of reaching out to Mark again was even worse. She had no place left to turn. Despite the loneliness, Samantha kept trying to push forward. She found a part-time job at a local cafe, though it hardly paid enough to cover rent, let alone the expenses that came with preparing for a baby. She scraped by, counting the days until her next paycheck. There were days when she felt like she couldn't go on, when the exhaustion from juggling work and the constant emotional turmoil seemed too much to bear. There were days when she questioned whether she was strong enough to face motherhood alone. But through it all, she did what she could to survive. She pushed through the pain, ignored the gnawing feelings of abandonment, and tried to keep moving forward, even when every step felt like an uphill battle. It was during these dark days that Samantha realized just how deep the betrayal from her family ran. They hadn't just failed to offer her a helping hand. They had failed to recognize her pain, to stand by her when she needed them most. She had spent her entire life trying to live up to their expectations, trying to make them proud. But now, it seemed as though none of it mattered. They hadn't offered her comfort. They hadn't offered her kindness. They had told her to fix it on her own, as if her struggles were nothing more than a nuisance to them. Samantha's frustration grew with each passing day. She couldn't understand why her family, the people she had always relied on, had turned their backs on her. And as much as she tried to forgive them, she couldn't shake the hurt. they weren't just rejecting her, they were rejecting her child, too. The sense of abandonment cut deeper than she had ever expected. She was supposed to be able to count on her family, but now she had to figure out how to make it all work by herself. It was painful and it was unfair, but somehow she had to accept that her family wasn't going to be the safety net she thought they were. And so, as the days wore on, Samantha kept going. She kept pushing forward, through the loneliness, the fear, and the hurt. She had no choice but to rely on herself, to become the kind of person she had never thought she would need to be. Independent, resilient, and strong. Even if she didn't have the support she deserved, she would have to find a way to survive. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in her life, she realized that it was up to her to create it. Samantha sat in her small, dimly lit apartment, staring out of the window. The city below her buzzed with life, but inside her, there was only emptiness. She had been here for weeks now, adjusting to the solitude and the weight of responsibility she had never imagined bearing alone. She had gone from feeling like she had no place to go to having an apartment that, while tiny and underwhelming, was hers. The thought of it should have given her some comfort, but it didn't. It was just another reminder of how far she had fallen from everything she had known before. In the beginning, she had clung to the hope that things would get better. She thought that after the initial shock, her family would come around. But they hadn't. Her mother's lukewarm response had been followed by more silence, and Mark had become even more distant. The hurt she felt from her parents' refusal to stand by her had festered, turning into a bitter resentment that she couldn't shake. They were too busy with their own lives, too wrapped up in their own concerns, to offer the kind of unconditional support she needed. Every time she reached out, she felt like an inconvenience. Their priorities seemed to lie elsewhere, with their jobs, their routines, their comfortable lives. Samantha couldn't help but feel that, in their eyes, she had become just another problem to be dealt with. Her mind drifted to the money she had sent them over the years. It was something she had always done, ever since she'd gotten her first job out of high school. She had always tried to ease their burdens, to give them a little extra whenever she could. Her father had always worked hard to provide for the family, but with the economy being what it was, there were times when they struggled. Samantha had done what she could to help, even if it meant stretching her own finances thin. It felt like a small way to repay them for all the sacrifices they had made for her. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was her way of showing her gratitude, of being the responsible, caring daughter she thought they wanted her to be. But now, as she sat alone in her apartment, the thought of sending them any more money seemed unbearable. How could she continue to support them when they had turned their backs on her? When she needed them the most, they had dismissed her pain, making excuses for Mark's behavior instead of acknowledging that she had been wronged. It wasn't just that they hadn't offered her the emotional support she had needed. It was that they hadn't even considered the possibility that they should be there for her in the way she had always been there for them. The realization that they saw her as a burden, someone who needed to fix her life before they could help, had stung more than she could put into words. Samantha knew that she had no choice but to stop sending money to her parents. It wasn't out of malice or spite, but because it no longer felt like something she owed them. They had never asked for her financial help in the first place, and they certainly hadn't asked for her emotional support either. They had told her time and time again that she needed to take responsibility for her own choices, and now, with everything that had happened, it felt like she was the one who needed to focus on herself. She couldn't afford to keep giving when she had nothing left to give. The thought of stopping the payments felt strange at first. It was as if she were betraying them, even though she knew she wasn't. For years, she had been the one to step up, the one to take care of things. It was part of who she was, part of how she had always seen herself within her family. But now, she realized that the dynamic had shifted. She couldn't keep pouring from an empty cup. If her family wasn't going to offer the same kind of support, then it was time for her to step back and start taking care of herself. The thought of severing this connection made her uneasy, but deep down, she knew it was the right decision. It was time to stop being the one who gave and start being the one who received, even if that meant learning to rely on herself. She felt a mix of emotions: relief, guilt, anger, but mostly exhaustion. She had spent so much of her life trying to be the perfect daughter, the one who always did the right thing. But now, she was learning that perfection didn't exist. She wasn't going to get everything right. And sometimes, even when you did everything you thought was right, things still fell apart. The realization that her family wasn't going to be there to catch her, that she couldn't rely on them to pick up the pieces, had been the hardest pill to swallow. But she had swallowed it, and now she had to find a way to move forward. Samantha took a deep breath, trying to push the emotions down. She wasn't going to let herself get lost in them. She had already cried more tears than she could count, and at some point she had realized that crying wasn't going to change anything. She had to find a way to keep going, to make the most of what she had. She was carrying a child, and that alone was a reason to keep fighting, to keep moving forward. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the life growing inside her, the little person she would soon be responsible for. Her priorities had shifted, and she had no choice but to put everything else aside and focus on building a future for them both. The next few days were a blur of decisions. Samantha continued working her part-time job, struggling to make ends meet, but she was determined to make it work. She began budgeting more carefully, cutting out any unnecessary expenses and doing everything she could to stretch every dollar. It wasn't easy. Every month felt like a balancing act, trying to juggle rent, food, and the other basic necessities. But she was getting better at it. She had no choice but to be resourceful. There were days when the weight of it all threatened to crush her, but she learned to push through, to focus on one task at a time. She also started to focus more on preparing for the baby. She researched what she needed, buying secondhand items whenever possible. She asked friends and acquaintances for advice, learning how to make the most of what she had. There was no way she could afford all the brand new things that some mothers could, but that didn't matter to her. She wasn't interested in perfection anymore. She just wanted to give her child what they needed, even if it meant sacrificing some of her own desires. In the midst of all this, Samantha realized something profound. As much as her family had let her down, she was stronger than she had ever given herself credit for. She had been so focused on their approval, on meeting their expectations, that she had forgotten to focus on herself. She had spent years trying to live up to what they wanted her to be, but now she realized that it was time to stop seeking their validation. It wasn't about them anymore. It was about her and her child, and she had the power to build a future for them both. She didn't need anyone's approval to know she was doing the right thing. Samantha's thoughts often drifted back to her parents, especially when the loneliness felt too much to bear. She had always imagined that, in a time of need, they would be there for her. But they weren't, and she couldn't keep waiting for them to change. She had to let go of that expectation, painful as it was. She couldn't keep living in the past, clinging to the idea of the family she thought she would have. She had to accept that her family wasn't the safety net she had once believed it to be. And as hard as it was, that meant no longer offering them the support she had always given so freely. There were times when the anger flared up, when she felt betrayed by everyone she had loved and trusted. But those moments were becoming fewer and farther between. Slowly, she was learning to forgive them, not because they deserved it, but because she needed to move on. She wasn't going to waste any more of her energy on resentment. The future was too important. One evening, after a long day at work, Samantha sat down on her couch, cradling her stomach with both hands. She was tired, physically, emotionally, and mentally, but there was a peace that had begun to settle over her. It wasn't a perfect peace, but it was something. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, and there would be times when she felt like giving up. But she was determined not to. She was learning to take life one day at a time, to find strength in herself that she had never known she had. The future was uncertain, but one thing was for sure. She wasn't going to face it alone. And as she looked down at her growing belly, she knew that she wasn't alone anymore. She had someone to fight for, and that was enough. Samantha woke up to the sound of rain tapping softly against her window. She rubbed her eyes and sat up, stretching as she glanced around her modest apartment. The small space had become her world, her sanctuary, her refuge, and in some ways her prison. The walls, once so confining, had started to feel like home. It wasn't the life she had envisioned for herself, but it was the life she had, and she was doing the best she could. The reality of being a single mother was heavy, but over the past few months, Samantha had adapted. She had built a routine, something she could rely on, something that provided a semblance of stability. It wasn't much, but it was something. Her days were filled with work, errands, and the small tasks that kept life ticking along. At night, she would lay in bed, hands gently resting on her swollen belly, imagining the life she would create for her child. The loneliness was still there, but it wasn't as consuming as it had been. She had learned to fill the silence with her own thoughts, to find peace within herself. Her part-time job at the cafe had become a lifeline, even if it didn't pay well. It was something to do, a way to keep her mind engaged, to meet people, even if only briefly. Most of her coworkers were kind, but there was always a sense of distance, as though they knew her situation and didn't quite know how to approach it. Samantha didn't mind. She wasn't there to make friends. She was there to survive, and survive she would. The thought of asking for help or leaning on anyone else felt foreign. She had learned the hard way that relying on others could leave her disappointed. But as the months wore on, she began to see a glimmer of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way forward that didn't involve constantly looking back at the past. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, breaking her thoughts. She wiped her hands on her apron before walking over to pick it up. It was a message from her old friend Rachel, someone she had known since high school. Rachel had been a good friend, and while they had drifted apart over the years, they had reconnected when Samantha moved to the city. Rachel had always been there for her, even when Samantha had pushed people away. The message was simple but filled with warmth. "Hey, Sam, I was thinking about you today. How are you holding up? Want to grab lunch sometime this week?" Samantha smiled, feeling a rush of gratitude. Rachel had no idea how much it meant to her to hear from someone who genuinely cared. She hadn't had many friends in the city, and the few she had made were acquaintances at best. Rachel, however, had always made an effort to stay connected, to make sure Samantha wasn't alone. Samantha quickly typed a response. "I'd love that. It's been a while. How about Thursday?" Rachel replied almost immediately. "Perfect. I'll pick you up at noon. Looking forward to catching up." Samantha's heart lightened at the thought of spending time with someone who still wanted to be a part of her life. It had been so long since she had had an actual conversation with someone who cared, who didn't look at her as an afterthought. It was strange how people often overlook those who were struggling, but Rachel had never been one to turn away. In that moment, Samantha realized how important it was to nurture the relationships that mattered, to cherish the few connections she had. The next few days flew by, filled with work, preparing her apartment for the baby, and, of course, the growing anticipation of seeing Rachel. By the time Thursday afternoon rolled around, Samantha felt a surge of excitement. It was a welcome change from the monotony of her routine, a chance to step out of the bubble she had created for herself. When Rachel pulled up outside the cafe, Samantha felt a rush of warmth. It had been months since they had seen each other, but Rachel's familiar smile and the way she waved from the car made it feel like no time had passed at all. Samantha climbed into the passenger seat, grateful for the moment of normalcy. As they drove to a nearby restaurant, they fell easily into conversation, catching up on each other's lives. Rachel was as easy to talk to as she had always been, and before long the conversation shifted to more personal matters. Samantha found herself telling Rachel about the last few months, the difficulties she had faced, the isolation, and the emotional toll of being pregnant and alone. She had never been one to openly discuss her feelings, but there was something about Rachel's calm demeanor that made it easy. "I just didn't expect it to be this hard, you know?" Samantha said, her voice low. "I thought I could do it on my own, but sometimes I just feel so exhausted, like I'm carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders." Rachel listened intently, nodding. "I can't pretend to know exactly what you're going through, Sam, but I do know that it's okay to feel overwhelmed. You don't have to do this alone. You don't have to carry all of it by yourself." Samantha felt a lump form in her throat, and she quickly looked down, trying to compose herself. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her like that. So long since anyone had reminded her that it was okay to ask for help, to lean on someone when the world felt heavy. Rachel reached across the table, placing a comforting hand on Samantha's. "I know it's not easy, but I'm here for you," Rachel said softly. "You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be you." For the first time in months, Samantha allowed herself to feel the tears that had been building up inside her. She wasn't alone. Someone cared. And that realization hit her like a wave, bringing with it a sense of relief that was almost overwhelming. Later, as they walked back to Rachel's car, Rachel turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "Sam, I know you've been going through a lot with your family, but I want you to know something. You don't have to prove anything to them. You've already proven what you're capable of. You've got this." Samantha felt the weight of Rachel's words sink deep into her heart. For so long, she had felt like she needed to prove herself to everyone around her, to her parents who had refused to acknowledge her pain, to Mark who had turned his back on her. But Rachel was right. Samantha had already proven her strength. She had survived the worst moments, and now she had to believe that she could thrive, not just survive. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of laughter and light-hearted conversation. It felt good to be reminded of the person she used to be, the girl who had once dreamed of a future filled with possibilities. Samantha had spent so long feeling like a failure, but she was beginning to see that failure wasn't the end. It was simply a part of the journey, a stepping stone to something better. And for the first time in months, she felt a spark of hope for the future. That night, as she lay in bed, Samantha rested her hands on her belly once more. She thought about the child growing inside her, about the life they would share. She was no longer consumed by the idea of what she had lost or the family that had turned away from her. She couldn't change what had happened, but she could choose how to move forward, and she was done looking back. She had learned that sometimes the people you need most aren't the ones you expect. Sometimes they come from unexpected places, from the friends you've made along the way, or even from the quiet strength within yourself. It wasn't the life she had imagined, but it was her life, and she was determined to make the most of it. She was no longer waiting for someone to come to her rescue. She was going to be the one to rescue herself. In the months that followed, Samantha's life began to change in small but meaningful ways. She continued to work hard, preparing for the baby's arrival. Her relationship with Rachel grew stronger, and they spent more time together, talking, laughing, and sharing the challenges of life. Samantha learned to lean on the people who truly cared, to accept that she didn't have to carry everything alone. When the day came that she gave birth to a healthy baby boy, Samantha was overwhelmed with emotion. She had done it. She had brought a new life into the world, and she was ready to be the best mother she could be. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, but she also knew that she was capable of facing whatever came her way. As she looked into her son's eyes for the first time, she realized that the future wasn't about perfection. It was about love, resilience, and the strength to keep moving forward no matter what. And in that moment, Samantha knew that she had everything she needed to build the life she and her child deserved. She was no longer defined by her past or by the people who had let her down. She was defined by the strength she had found within herself, and that was enough.